The lawyer's office smelled like dust and old wood polish, the kind that clings to everything and makes you feel like you're not supposed to speak too loudly. I sat stiffly on the leather chair, hands folded in my lap, not expecting much. My sister, Lena, sat across from me with that blank expression she wore like armor, the kind that always made it impossible to know what she was actually thinking. We hadn't spoken in over a year. I didn't even know she'd be at the reading of the will. Grandma had been everything to us. Not warm in the traditional sense, not the type to bake cookies or coddle us, but steady. Unshakable. Her house in the countryside was the one place that ever felt safe when we were growing up. Even when our parents fought. Even when Lena and I stopped talking. That house held something that couldn't be put into words, and I didn't know how much it meant to me until the moment I heard the lawyer say it. To my granddaughter, I leave the house at Orchard Hill in its entirety, its land, contents, and title, along with the journals stored in the upstairs chest. He kept reading, but I didn't hear the rest. Not immediately. The words echoed in my chest, bouncing off the memories I'd buried without meaning to. The orchard swings, the uneven floorboards in the hallway, the smell of dried lavender and rain. Lena didn't flinch. Not a twitch. Her eyes didn't even move. She received a small savings bond and a collection of antique jewelry. Things that had value, but no roots. I glanced at her, searching for something, resentment, jealousy, confusion, but her expression didn't crack. She just nodded, thanked the lawyer, and stood as if she'd been through this before. I stayed seated. Not because I had more questions, but because I suddenly felt the weight of what I'd been given, and the guilt of feeling grateful for it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the will in my head. The last line especially, the part about the journals. Grandma's handwriting had always been sharp, looped with intention. I hadn't seen it in years, not since her last letter. I thought about calling Lena, asking her if she wanted to come with me to the house, just to visit it together one last time, but the silence between us was too old. Too layered. Too fragile to touch. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I packed a bag, grabbed the key I still had on my ring, and headed out of the city before the traffic could trap me. I didn't tell anyone. I just drove. The air got thinner the farther I got from the concrete and sirens. The trees turned fuller. The roads narrowed. And when I finally saw the turn for Orchard Hill, I felt something tighten in my chest, not anxiety, not excitement, just a heavy sort of pull, like the past reaching up to wrap itself around my ribs. The gate was open when I arrived. That was the first thing. It should have been latched. Grandma was obsessive about that. Then I noticed the garden, trimmed. Not just tended, but fresh. Green onions poked through the soil. The porch had been swept clean. There was even a pair of sandals by the steps, half tucked beneath the bench. For a moment, I thought maybe a neighbor had been taking care of it. Or that maybe I had the wrong day. But I pushed the thought away and grabbed my bag. The house key was cool in my hand as I stepped up the porch stairs, the wood groaning faintly under my weight. I unlocked the door slowly, expecting stillness. But as soon as it opened, the smell hit me. Not dust. Not thyme. Fresh coffee. And something else, soft music playing in the background, a baby monitor humming on a nearby shelf, the distant sound of footsteps coming down the hall. I stood frozen in the doorway. And then I saw her. Lena. Barefoot. Holding a mug. Wearing a sweater I didn't recognize. She looked at me with the calm of someone expecting a guest, not the rightful owner of the home she had quietly taken. Behind her, a door creaked open. And out walked Michael. My ex-fiancé. Holding a child. His child. The three of them looked at me like they were surprised, but not caught. And in that moment, I realized the house I had inherited was already occupied by a family. A family I had never been invited to know. For a moment, no one moved. Lena stared at me as if I were just another delivery driver who had taken a wrong turn, calm and unreadable as ever, and Michael, standing in the center of Grandma's hallway holding a toddler on his hip, didn't flinch, didn't stammer, didn't even speak. He just blinked like someone slowly recognizing the consequences of a decision made long ago and never intended to confront. The baby in his arms, a girl maybe 2 or 3, looked up at me with the unfiltered curiosity of someone too young to understand the tension pulsing through the room. I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. My throat felt tight, and for a second I thought maybe this was a nightmare, that I'd driven too long, that grief was playing tricks on me, that maybe the GPS had brought me to a parallel life where my sister lived comfortably in the house I now legally owned, married to the man who had left me without explanation. Lena finally spoke. "You're here earlier than I thought you'd come," she said, not apologetic, not surprised, just factual, like she'd known this moment was coming for months and had rehearsed exactly how she'd handle it. I stepped into the room because I didn't know what else to do. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and every part of the house that used to feel warm and safe now felt stolen. I looked around at the familiar furniture, rearranged. The curtains, replaced. The kitchen table, now cluttered with a baby bottle, a half-read magazine, and a pair of toddler shoes. There were drawings taped to the wall, crayon flowers, and scribbles with Mom and Dad written in shaky letters. The smell of lavender still lingered faintly in the air, but it was buried under the scent of breakfast and laundry detergent and someone else's life. I looked at Michael then, really looked at him for the first time in years, and it was like facing a stranger with a face I had once memorized. His hair was longer, his jawline softer, but his eyes hadn't changed, still cautious, still distant, still holding back more than they ever offered. He shifted the child on his hip and said my name once, quietly, like he wasn't sure he had the right to use it. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was still staring at Lena, trying to make sense of how my sister, the one who hugged me at my engagement party and helped me pick out my wedding dress, was now standing in my grandmother's kitchen, married to the man who'd left me just months before our wedding, with a child whose existence I had never even heard about. "How long have you been living here?" I asked, my voice sharp and too steady for how much my hands were shaking. Lena took a sip from her mug before answering, like this was just an ordinary conversation. "Almost a year," she said, "since Grandma got sick." I blinked. "She knew?" Lena nodded. "She knew everything." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because if I didn't, I might scream. "And she still left the house to me." Lena's face didn't move. "She did." Michael finally spoke. "This wasn't how we wanted you to find out." I turned toward him with a look that must have cut through every defense he thought he still had. "No?" I said. "You didn't want me to find out like this? Then maybe you shouldn't have hidden your new life in the one place that still felt like home." He lowered his eyes, and for the first time, he looked ashamed. But it was Lena's silence that hurt more than anything. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't embarrassed. She was just settled. Like she had already made peace with what she had taken, as if time and distance had erased the betrayal and replaced it with domestic routine. I looked at the child again, now playing quietly with a stuffed toy on the rug, and for a brief, painful moment, I wondered how old she was, how soon after the breakup she had been born, and if my grandmother had held her in this same room while never mentioning her once in her letters to me. There was too much to ask. Too much I didn't want to know. But one thing was already clear. This wasn't just about inheritance. This was about the life they had built behind my back, in a house I hadn't even known was occupied, under a roof that was never meant to shelter lies. And no matter how calm Lena looked, or how carefully Michael chose his words, they couldn't change the fact that I had come here to claim a home, only to find it already claimed by two people who once promised they loved me. I didn't speak again until I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where Grandma used to slice apples for pie and tell us stories about her childhood, the one where Lena and I used to play cards late into the night before everything between us soured into something quiet and bitter. It was surreal, sitting there now, while the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence and Michael paced slowly in the hallway, trying to calm the toddler who had started to cry. I stared at the grooves in the wood and wondered how long it had been since this table was last mine, how long since anything in this house had belonged to me in spirit, not just on paper. Lena sat across from me, still drinking her coffee like we were discussing weekend plans instead of the betrayal that had split an entire bloodline wide open. I finally looked her in the eye and said what I had been holding back since the second I stepped through the door. Did you love him while I was still with him? Her lips tightened, just slightly. She set her mug down with quiet precision and folded her hands like someone preparing to deliver a carefully rehearsed confession. No, she said, not then. Her voice didn't waver. But after you broke up, we ran into each other. And it happened. I didn't plan it. Neither did he. I stared at her, waiting for a tremble, a twitch, something human that showed even a flicker of guilt. Nothing came. He left me without a word, I said, my voice low and level. No explanation, no closure, just a text saying he couldn't do it, and that was it. I spent months trying to understand why. Now I know. Lena looked down at her hands. He was scared, she said. Of what? I asked. Commitment? Or the fact that he was already with you? She didn't answer. The silence between us wasn't empty, it was brimming with everything she didn't want to admit and everything I already knew. Michael came back into the room carrying the child, now asleep against his chest, and the sight of it made something inside me twist in a way I didn't expect. There had been a time when I imagined a life with him that looked exactly like this, quiet afternoons, a house with history, a child cradled in his arms. And now here it was, played out like a reenactment of the future I was supposed to have, except someone else had stepped into the role that was written for me. I stood slowly, needing space, needing distance from the air in that room. I walked to the far end of the house, toward Grandma's old sitting room, and opened the door gently. It looked almost untouched, books still lined the shelves, her knitting bag rested beside the armchair, a half-finished scarf still wound in the needles. The smell hit me immediately. Lavender and cedarwood. Her scent. Her presence. I stepped inside and felt tears sting the backs of my eyes, not just because of the betrayal or the shock, but because this was the first moment since she passed that I felt her again, fully, as if she were watching this unfold with quiet sorrow from beyond the veil. When I turned around, Lena was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. I didn't want her there. Not in this room. Not in that moment. But she didn't move. She knew, Lena said, quietly. About us. She found out a few months after we got together. And she didn't kick us out. She said nothing. My jaw clenched. But she didn't give you the house. Lena's mouth twitched, just slightly. No, she said. She didn't. Why do you think that is? I asked. She didn't respond. I walked past her, back toward the kitchen. The weight of every step settled deeper in my chest. I opened the drawer beneath the hallway mirror, Grandma's drawer for spare keys, receipts, and handwritten notes, and found something I hadn't expected. An envelope. My name on the front in Grandma's handwriting, unmistakable. I stared at it for a second, heart pounding like I had just opened a door to a room I hadn't realized was locked. I took the letter out, closed the drawer, and turned around slowly. Because whatever came next, I knew the truth wasn't going to come from them. It was going to come from her. I didn't read the letter right away. I held it in my hand for a long while, sitting at the edge of Grandma's bed, the same bed I used to curl up in as a child when thunderstorms rattled the windows and I couldn't sleep. The envelope was thin but heavy, the paper warm from my grip, and I could feel her presence in every loop of ink on the front. I knew that whatever was inside would change the way I remembered her. The question was whether it would make things better or worse. The floor creaked in the hallway. I heard Lena's footsteps and the faint shuffle of Michael putting the baby down in the nursery across the hall. They were moving through the house like they belonged there. Like they had always belonged there. And maybe they had, at least in their minds. I took a breath, unfolded the flap, and carefully pulled out the single sheet tucked inside. Her handwriting filled the page, sharp and elegant, the kind she never changed, even when arthritis set into her fingers. My dearest girl, it began. If you're reading this, then the house is now yours, and I imagine by now, you've discovered everything I chose not to say aloud. I wanted to explain, but I didn't know how. There are things I carried in silence, not because I didn't trust you, but because I knew the truth would hurt more than my silence ever could. I knew about Lena and Michael. I knew long before you did. And it broke my heart in ways I still don't have words for. But I also knew this house couldn't belong to them. Not truly. Not because I didn't care for them, but because it was never theirs in spirit. It was always yours. From the way you treated it, to the way you listened when it spoke to you through creaking boards and shifting light, to the way you understood its weight even as a child. I kept reading, each word cutting deeper than the last. She hadn't turned her back on me. She hadn't handed over my memories to people who broke me without a second glance. She had known. She had watched it unfold. And in her own quiet way, she had made a decision to leave the house to the one person who never claimed it, but always protected it. I thought about what Lena said, about Grandma knowing and saying nothing. And now I understood. She hadn't confronted them because she wanted the truth to land where it belonged. With me. In time. On my terms. I folded the letter slowly, placed it back in the envelope, and set it in the drawer beside the bed. When I came back into the hallway, Lena was waiting again. Arms crossed. Face unreadable. She'd always been good at holding her expression still, like glass. I stopped a few steps away from her. She knew, I said. Lena nodded. And she still gave it to me. Another nod. So tell me, I asked, not with anger, but with clarity, when you were living here, did it ever occur to you that you were occupying something that didn't belong to you? Lena didn't answer at first. She looked past me, toward the window, where the sun was beginning to lower across the orchard in slow gold waves. It felt like home, she said quietly. We didn't think you'd ever come back. Because you hoped I wouldn't, I replied. Lena looked down. I was happy here, she said. For the first time in a long time. Her voice cracked then, just slightly. And I was scared you'd take it away. I didn't come here to take anything, I said. I came because I didn't know this part of my life was being rewritten without me. But now that I know, I'm not going to just walk away. Michael stepped into the hallway then, silent as always, holding his daughter who was half asleep in his arms. He looked at me with the same look he wore when he walked out of my life, apologetic, but not enough to change anything. We didn't plan this, he said, for what must have been the 10th time. It just happened. That's the thing about betrayal, I said. It always starts with something that just happens and ends with a choice someone doesn't have the courage to admit they made. I walked past them, back to the front of the house. The keys were still in my coat pocket, heavy now for different reasons. I reached for the front door, then turned around slowly. You both have 2 weeks, I said. To pack your things and move out. Lena's eyes widened slightly. Michael looked stunned. I'm not doing this out of revenge, I added. I'm doing this because the house was given to me, and not just in writing. It was mine long before either of you ever thought to step inside it. Lena opened her mouth, then closed it again. Michael held the child a little closer. No one protested. And I walked outside into the fading light, the air cooler now, the trees rustling with the soft certainty of everything changing. I didn't go back into the house that night. I drove to the edge of the village and stayed at a small roadside inn with sagging curtains and floral sheets that smelled faintly of mothballs and bleach. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, the letter still fresh in my memory, every word from my grandmother echoing not just as comfort, but as a quiet reminder that she had seen everything, and still chosen me. There was something strangely steadying about that. Not vindication, not triumph, just clarity. It was the first night in a long time I didn't feel like the one who had been left behind. The next morning, I returned to the house just after sunrise. I didn't knock. I used my key, because it was mine, and stepped inside to the smell of coffee already brewing and boxes beginning to gather in the corners of the living room. Lena was in the kitchen, her back turned to me, hair tied loosely, sleeves rolled up, packing dishes with quiet, mechanical movements. She didn't speak when I walked in, and I didn't either. We just stood there in a silence that wasn't angry, wasn't hostile, just full of everything we'd never said when it mattered. After a moment, she turned. "You're not staying here while we pack?" she asked. I shook my head. "No. I want the house to myself when I come back. I need to know it's really mine." Lena looked down, her hands tightening around the ceramic bowl she was wrapping. "She always loved you more," she said. It didn't sound bitter. It sounded tired. I met her gaze. "No, she didn't," I said. "She trusted me." "That's different." Michael wasn't in the room, and I didn't ask where he was. I didn't need to see him again. There was nothing left to salvage between us, no resentment worth dragging out, no apology that would ever rewrite what he'd done. He made a choice, and now I had made mine. And for the first time, I didn't feel small in the face of it. I didn't feel like the one who had been abandoned, or replaced, or forgotten. I felt like the one who had endured. I left a note on the hallway table before walking out. No accusations. No emotion. Just instructions, where to leave the keys, what day the locks would be changed, and that if anything in the house was taken without permission, I'd handle it through a lawyer. It wasn't a threat. It was a line. A clear, final one. The kind I'd never been strong enough to draw before. Driving away, I passed the orchard, rows of trees still bare from winter, the first hints of green buds peeking along their branches. I remembered running between them as a child, the way Grandma would call out from the porch with a warning about snakes in the tall grass, and how Lena and I would laugh and pretend not to hear her, barefoot and free and unaware of everything that would come later. I couldn't get those days back. I didn't want to. But I could reclaim the ground they stood on. When I returned a week later, the house was empty. The boxes were gone. The nursery had been cleared, the photos removed, the kitchen scrubbed down. Everything that had felt like an intrusion was erased, except the history that was already mine. I walked through each room slowly, not to inspect or judge, but to feel. To absorb. To begin again. Upstairs, I found Grandma's journals in the chest by the window, just where she said they'd be. I opened the top one and flipped through the pages, her handwriting steady and sharp even in old age. She wrote about the seasons, the orchard, her fears about growing frail, her doubts about Lena's choices, her heartbreak at watching our family drift apart. But what struck me most was one line, near the end of a page: "Some things are worth protecting, even if it means waiting for the right hands to carry them forward." I closed the journal and looked out the window. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows over the porch, the trees, the road beyond. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt responsible. I felt grounded. I felt like I had arrived, not to take back what was stolen, but to finally begin living without waiting for someone else to validate what was always mine. Spring came slowly that year, like the house itself was holding its breath and waiting to see if I would really stay. The days grew longer, the trees budded one by one, and the silence inside the walls no longer felt like grief, it felt like peace. I kept the windows open most afternoons, let the wind carry out whatever pieces of the past still lingered in corners I hadn't touched. I repainted the kitchen, cleared out the attic, and planted new herbs in the garden, the way Grandma used to. Not to erase what came before, but to reassert the truth of what this place had always been, mine. Lena didn't reach out. Neither did Michael. There were no follow-ups, no letters, no late-night apologies. And for once, I didn't need them. Their absence felt like a clean break instead of a wound. I didn't check their social media, didn't ask mutual friends for updates, didn't linger in the doorway of what-ifs. They had made their choices behind closed doors, and now I had closed mine, not out of revenge, but because I was done leaving it open for people who didn't knock. I found old photographs in the basement, pictures of me and Lena playing in the yard, Grandma waving from the porch, our parents younger than I could remember. There was one of Michael and me too, from a summer when we thought we had forever, both of us smiling like nothing in the world could touch us. I didn't rip it up. I didn't burn it. I just put it in a box and slid it under the bed, not out of sentiment, but because it belonged to a life that no longer needed explaining. Every morning, I brewed coffee in the same old pot, sat on the porch with a journal of my own, and wrote about nothing and everything, the sound of the wind, the birds nesting in the trees, the feeling of waking up without a shadow across my chest. I painted the nursery a soft green and turned it into a studio. The room that once held someone else's child now held a canvas, brushes, and light. That, more than anything, felt like closure. Some neighbors dropped by in the weeks that followed, people who remembered Grandma and came bearing pie or stories or both. They asked polite questions about the family, but I kept my answers simple. It's just me now, I'd say, and that was enough. I wasn't the girl who got left at the altar anymore. I wasn't the forgotten granddaughter. I wasn't the second choice in someone else's love story. I was just someone who came back, cleaned up the damage, and rebuilt with her own hands. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like return. Like reclaiming something I didn't even realize I'd lost until I walked through that front door and saw how much had changed without me. And though I couldn't undo what Lena and Michael did, I could refuse to carry the weight of it any longer. I could refuse to be shaped by people who broke promises and called it love. One evening, as the sky turned gold over the orchard, I stood by the gate and looked out over the land, acres of quiet, rows of trees, the sun setting exactly the way it used to when I was young and whole and unafraid. I remembered Grandma's voice then, not any one sentence, just the rhythm of it, firm, calm, wise. I knew she would have stood beside me in that moment, proud but not loud, nodding once and trusting that I'd figure out the rest. And I had. In the end, they had the wedding, the child, the comfort, but I had the house, the history, and the truth. They took something that didn't belong to them. I took it back without begging, without vengeance, without noise. And I made it mine again.